Tie your kangaroo down and listen up. It's time for another stellar edition of .NET Rocks, the internet audio talk show for .NET developers with Carl Franklin and Rory Blythe. This is Karen Cavallaro here to announce show number 58 with guest Tony Bain, recorded live Friday, April 2nd, 2004. Carl is away this week, and Rory's guest co-host is none other than Uber Geek cum Microsoft employee Chris Sells. .NET Rocks is brought to you by Franklin's Net, training developers to work smarter, and now offering hands-on VB.NET and ASP.NET classes remotely. Online at www.franklins.net. And by Data Dynamics, makers of ActiveReports.NET. Simple, powerful, and cost-effective reporting for Windows Forms and ASP.NET web applications. Online at www.datadynamics.com. Support is also provided by Code Magazine, Microsoft Technologies in-depth for IT managers and developers. Online at www.code-magazine.com. And by Peter Bloom, offering stellar yet very affordable ASP.NET server controls, including validation controls, date and calendar controls, and much, much more. Online at peterblum.com. And now, the funniest bastard I personally know, Rory Blythe.
20 feet wide, strap it in tight, 'cause it's a long, sweet ride.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Karen, and everybody else for tuning in. This is .NET Rocks, and you're probably noticing that something is a little different today. All right, so what's going on is Carl Franklin, the usual regular host of the show, is off in Indiana giving a class, and he is obviously pretty unavailable. So the place he's at is called Atlas Van Lines. We're going to get a shout-out to those guys and move along. So I'm Rory, and for the week, for the Bizarro episode, I am going to be the host. And with me in Portland, Oregon, as you probably heard in the intro, is super-duper cool Microsoft Uber geek. You know, all I got was Rory Blythe. So Microsoft super-duper, duperly, cool Uber geek, Chris Sells. You there, Chris?
I am, but, you know, I have to point out, Rory, that you got far more than just, Rory Blythe, right? You got the funniest bastard I personally know. And, I've never been billed like that.
Yeah, okay, fine. Okay, that's true.
I did have one case where my wife looked at me and said that I was a cold-hearted bastard. and I said, because, my parents were actually married by the time I was born.
So you're just cold-hearted?
Well, it's funny, but my wife came right back to me and said, but your parents had the marriage annulled. So it was 10:30 at night, and I was calling my mom and asking her what she had to say about that.
Yeah. Wow. Well, okay. I guess good for you, good for me. That's kind of an interesting little story there, Chris. So what's going on? Like, what's going on out there on the West Coast where I lived until so recently?
So I was just noticing, I read the IEEE, I'm a member of IEEE, and they send me their little magazine, and I was reading yesterday that a bunch of the universal constants that we know and love have actually changed.
What are you talking about?
I'm talking about that they have remeasured from 5 years ago. So the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST.gov, our own government agency that tracks these things, they have actually tracked a difference between, Avogadro's number in the last 5 years. In fact, I did the calculations, and Avogadro's number is 0.000007% different in only 5 years. And the bad news is it's decreasing, which means that the number of molecules in a constant mass is now lower than it used to be.
Yeah, did everybody get that?
But, think what that means. That means that the universe is expanding at a non-zero rate, and eventually, if it keeps up,
it's never gonna collapse. Is that what you're saying?
I'm just saying that it's not collapsing yet.
Okay, all right. So if everybody got that, the universe is not collapsing yet. All right, that's the kind of stuff we thought we'd tell you about today. The managed coders out there who are sitting around kind of wondering if the universe was yet entering its collapsing stage. I guess it isn't quite yet because Adegbovago's number indicates that
they don't teach that in BB school.
Yeah, they totally forgot. They don't teach it in Rory dropped out of high school either. Okay, and they also don't teach it in Rory isn't a member of the IEEE Super World Council of Smart Guys school either. All right,
but I guess the reason I bring this up isn't because the universe is expanding and that disturbs me, but rather because if universal constants are changing at a noticeable rate,
right?
Then
my clock's wrong.
Well, then what?
My clock's wrong. That's probably the problem, eh?
Yes, because the number of atoms in your clock
I'm
going to
be late. All right. Okay, so as you were saying before I interrupted.
But if universal constants, right? I mean, the speed of light, all of these constants are changing, and if they're all changing at some noticeable, measurable rate, then nobody has any grounds on which to complain about the rate of change of technology, because we're just trying to keep up with the universe as a whole.
Well, that was a bit of a stretch.
I really had to go for that one, didn't I?
All right, well, cool. So I guess we might as well just get right along with things here. We heard about the universal constant Adegbovago number change from Chris, which we're all waiting for. And which is actually, you know what, though? Before we move along, Chris, as long as you're doing the show, as long as you're doing us a favor, let's do you a favor. Is there anything you're trying to sell right now or unload on the unsuspecting millions that you'd like to make a little bit of money off of? What do we got going on here? Like maybe, what do I see in my crystal ball? Like a comic book collection?
Actually, it's, yes, I am actually selling a 2 decades old comic book collection.
It's 36,000 copies, right?
It's actually 2,600.
Well, yeah, but universal constants are changing. All right.
Yes, but that would be the same number of comic books, but fewer molecules in them.
Yeah, right over Rory's head. Whoop. Okay, so anyway, we got the how many issues are you trying to sell?
2,600, and they're all available on eBay through this great startup I found in Seattle called Bidadoo. And what they do is they do all the goo associated with putting up, especially like collections and things up on eBay. They figure out how much it is, and they bring in experts to evaluate things and tell them how to bundle it and price it. And they take all the pictures and they put it all up on eBay and they handle all the shipping. And then they just take a percentage off the top and they send you a check.
Cool. All right. So if anybody wants to go out and buy those comic books that way, you can do it, or you can just send me a check and I'll give Chris a cut and everything's good. So, all right. So now let's get on with the rest of the show. And the first thing we like to do, Chris, since you are the new co-host, this is kind of funny because, the host chair opened up, which meant that the co-host chair opened up, which meant you had to fill the co-host chair. Although you're actually going to do one of the host bits right now, and that was pretty complicated, but I just had even more complicated than that guy's number stupid thing.
For people that can't pronounce it, they typically call it avocado's number.
Avocado's number. I like that because it's like a hooked on phonics sort of thing. It's dumbed down to the Rory level. It's like those Fisher-Price toys where you spin the thing in the center, it goes moo. That definitely takes a lot of the sting out of it for me. Associated with something I know.
That's what journalism majors who find themselves programming computers generally say.
Okay, so everybody, Chris is going to be reading the fan mail today. I hope that doesn't freak you out too much. It is Bizarro episode, so this is going to happen. And Chris, do you happen to have the email up in front of you and ready to be read?
I do. You gave me far more than enough time to get that first email up.
Good. All right. Well, then let's get on with it.
So this is an email from Michael Kennedy, and it says, "Hey, Carl." So he's going to be really disappointed when he hears that Carl's not involved at all. Michael Kennedy from UnitedBinary.com. So apparently they've got all the ones and zeros over there. And it says, "Hey, Carl, I have been seriously listening to .NET Rocks the last month or so," as opposed to when he was casually listening, I guess. "I have just about listened to the more recent half of your shows. It's almost time to start at the beginning with the older ones. I really enjoyed them all. I was listening to your show with Kevin McNeish about object spaces. I'm a big fan of typed data sets, so I expect object spaces will be right up my alley. This is just an editor's note for me. I expect so, too. I'm looking forward to object spaces myself, so I think that's really cool. Also, I'm writing to let you know," this is the letter again, "that a friend of mine, Scott Bellware, has written the best object spaces overview article I've seen to date." And then he gives an URL. "Keep on .NET rocking. Regards, Michael."
Cool. All right. So I don't know how this works. I think we're supposed to figure out something like send them a mug or something. But we'll get to that later. We're just the temporary host.
Yeah, with the
co-host
lackeys, we'll let the professionals do the actual work.
Yeah, we'll figure that out later. Or actually, I guess I'll figure, or somebody will. Okay, so I'm sorry to interrupt. God, Chris, please continue.
So how does the protocol work? Are we supposed to?
Oh, well, typically we would read the mail, and if there's anything immediately pressing about the mail, like I've got a grease fire, how do I put it out? Then we would answer that question. But if it's more of just like a comment kind of thing, like, hey, the show's good and I'm enjoying myself and I like object spaces and you like object spaces, then we just kind of move on to the next one and we say thank you very much for the mail. You're a very nice listener. You're our favorite listener, and then we say the exact same thing about the next person. So.
Right. So, okay. So far, Michael, I have to say, with all honesty, you are my favorite fan mail listener.
You're doing pretty good for a first timer here. Yeah.
Okay. So here is one from David Eggins, and he's from industry.gov.ua. So he's from the Australian government. Wow. And did they really have a government in Australia? I thought it was just Wild West out there.
Big collective. People hanging out, surfing.
Yeah. So, okay, he says, hello, Carl and gang. So I guess we're the gang. Could you recommend an automated coding standard source code modifier? I could not come up with a better name for it. I think that's a fabulous name, David. I need to point a tool at our VS.NET 2003 projects and have it modify all the code to conform to our standards. I have heard about tools to do this, but cannot lay my hands on any at the moment. I also figured you would have the resources to find out which the best ones are. What information like this would also be handy for your listeners? Thank you, David.
So, Chris, do you have anything off the top of your head that might do that?
Actually, well, it depends on what his coding standards are.
Okay.
Right? If his coding standards include things like the beauty of Visual Basic is that, the coding standard is built right into the tool. Right? You press enter and whammo, the coding standard takes effect. But other languages are a little more forgiving about such things. And like, for example, the semicolon-enabled languages, I assume that's the
enhanced,
kind of thing.
Right.
Yes.
Semicolon enhanced, right.
Now with semicolons. So there have been a bunch of tools over the years. I mean, this has been something that has gone on ever since we had code that didn't have to start at column 7. I mean, the need to format code in various formats. If we're talking about formatting code, there are various tools, commercial and free tools out there. I can't point to one that's better than the rest, except my personal favorite, unfortunately, is still under development, and it's part of Visual Studio 2005. I don't know if you've checked out that beta yet, David, but there is we're not even at beta. Sorry, the preview. But there is a ton of source code formatting options, more than I would ever want or need in the new Visual Studio 2005. And if all you care about in your coding standard is the way things are arranged, then you're all set. If you care about more than that, for example, how variables are named, or that there be fewer than one bug per 2 lines of code, things like that, you're going to have to get some other kind of tool. And actually, I don't really know of any tools that actually detect the bug thing, so that's going to be a problem. But things like FXCOP can go through and check all kinds of things like, these classes all have to have a default constructor, or these classes have to have variables of this name, type, or, things like that. FXCOP is your...
Doesn't FXCOP, though, go through and ensure that your code complies to the Microsoft standards? Isn't that the job of FXCOP?
So FXCOP, by default, comes with a ton of standard rules that Microsoft themselves runs against the .NET framework and all the libraries and the code that they ship to the world.
Right.
But it's extensible. So if you wanted to either turn off any or all of our rules that we ship with and add your own, you can do that.
Okay. Well, I'm a little less ignorant now. Cool.
Well, I can only do so much.
So do we have any more letters in there?
Oh, yeah, we have plenty. Here's one from Michael Elsdorfer from elsdorfer.net. He has his very own domain, which, is always a sign of class and style. And the subject is, I want useless crap, but make it look like I have some suggestions.
Well, that was a really good idea, man. Thanks for the really good suggestions.
So, yes, exactly. Well, we can just skip the formalities if you want and just send him useless
Send
crap.
you stuff. Do you just want a check or cash? We'll just work something out here. Why don't you just mug us?
So Michael is also going to be disappointed when he hears me reading his fan mail because it says, "Hi, Carl. Hi, Rory. Liked last week's show very much. Thanks for your great work."
Well, today, Chris, you're polymorphic. All right.
I guess. Well, wait. Am I Carl or Rory?
Co-host equals co-host as Carl. All right.
Yes, but that doesn't make any sense, right? Because you're normally the co-host.
Well, so yeah, but today I'm the host.
Shouldn't I be like drawing, cartoons that nobody can interpret and pointing out other people's penises and referring to my mom a lot in my blog? Shouldn't I be doing those kinds of things?
It's my grandmother, and that's a totally different Rory Blythe. So is there any more fan mail in there? We got anything going on?
He does actually have a body to this message, too, if you're interested
fabulous.
Just a little suggestion. What about employing an expert for choosing the Linux vulnerability of the week?
Ooh, ouch. An expert. Yeah. I mean, well.
Do we have experts on the show? I guess the guests, right? Not the host, certainly. He also has some interesting suggestions for future guests. Of course, Miguel, please try to get Miguel on the show. It would not only make Chris A. happy, but would also exchange the range of potential listeners to the whole mono and open source community.
And that's referring to Chris Anthony, the Linux guy who's been commenting a lot on my blog lately and who has recently picked up a copy of Windows and VS.NET to give everything a shot. Anyway, sorry, Chris.
Yeah, in fact, I wasn't reading his stuff until you pointed out. And it was funny, too, because I read that post about him picking up Windows.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, what a reasonable guy. And then I started reading the rest of the posts on his blog and changed my mind pretty quickly.
Yeah. Not too reasonable, but at least he's giving it a shot, right? At least he's going out and he's going to check things out and he can decide for himself based on technical merit what his opinions really are about Microsoft stuff instead of just listening to the opinions of his friends in IRC. So that's a good deal.
I agree that forming your own opinions is always a good thing.
Yeah, fantastic.
Even amongst the Linux crowd.
Okay.
So, but I do agree that getting Miguel on would be fabulous.
I've thought that too, actually. I've thought about trying to get him on the show. It would be a really interesting perspective, a really interesting .NET perspective.
Well, if you need help there, I've talked to the guy several times, so I'm happy to reach out to him.
I figured you knew him. I'm Chris Sells. I know everybody.
Sorry.
No, I figured you'd know him, and we might just have to talk to you about that a little later on.
And then he also said he wanted some Borlanders on. Borland recently, December 2003 to be exact, shipped Delphi 8 for the Microsoft .NET framework.
Oh.
I think they are the first certified .NET partner or something. And then
that would be
lists,
interesting.
Danny Thorpe or Anders Olsen or Alan Bauer as Borland guys to bring on the show.
That would be interesting.
I love that idea, actually, just because I'm just curious how. The common theme here is how non-Microsoft folks are making use of .NET.
Right.
Right. So that's a good theme because I'm a big fan of .NET everywhere.
Well, cool. We got anything else in that stack?
Just good luck on today's show, Michael. P.S. Rory, did you know Outlook's spell checker does not know your name?
Oh yes, I did know that. That will change, I'm sure. All right, if anybody out there is listening, this is a pretty big oversight, so let's just get that fixed. So, is that the end of the fan mail then, Chris?
That is the end of the fan mail.
Cool. Well, thanks everybody for writing in. We always appreciate hearing from the fans and stuff to tell us that either they like what we're doing or that we suck, because either way, we get something good or we learn something. So, never hesitate to write in.
Do people actually write in with "you guys suck"?
I get those personally at my site all the time, and we do occasionally get complaints from people out there because obviously anytime you stick something on the internet, you're attracting everybody in the whole universe, right? Some people might just stop over once for 30 seconds, read 3 letters of what you've written, and determine that you're a total bastard, and they'll write to let you know it, and then they'll disappear and they'll never come back. They just go from site to site insulting people and never following up on it. I'm sure you've gotten a bit of this yourself. Kind
of like a drive-by insulting, right? Yeah. They just stop blog to blog and saying things.
Yeah,
actually, I have gotten plenty of people sending me either personal email or blog comments letting me know that either they don't like what I said, or they
Right.
just don't like me personally.
Or that time that you tried to express your own opinion on your blog and it went a little haywire. Remember that? And that was a mistake.
I do remember that, but I cleaned out the herd that day, I'll tell you.
Yeah. I just love the way that people put so much weight and importance on their own decisions to leave, though. I mean, going through the comments in that particular blog, which I guess we won't bring up because you never know what kind of other fan mail you're going to generate. Just the people who write nothing but unsubscribed. Like, what's Chris going to do when he runs into this, powerful little message? Is he going to be on his knees weeping? Just, oh God, if I could have just kept that one reader, It's kind of a bad scene. Okay. So what we usually do now, Chris, and everybody else who's listening, is the Google Weirdos thing. And we have a little theme song here, and I'm going to play it, and I'm going to hope it comes out of the computer because I'm new at this whole running the show thing, and we'll just see what happens. Weirdos, 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 weirdos. Yeah, we all woke up with headaches the next morning. That
was hilarious. I've never heard that before.
Quite a weird night. All right, so for those of you who don't know, Google Weirdos is the spot that I do on the show where I talk about a lot of the ways that people are getting to my site. I comb through my logs and I look at the referrals, and I like to isolate the Google searches and see what kind of weird phrases brought people to me. Because usually they don't make any sense at all. Although, and longtime listeners are probably sick of hearing this, but I got to do it anyway for those, extra few people that have probably, shown up today. People who have caught on to Google Weirdos are using it to contact me personally. They're using Google as their own personal one-way email mechanism. And it's pretty cool. So what I do in Google Weirdos is, for the first half, I read the, quote, fan mail that I get, because a lot of it is usually pretty inflammatory. And then for the second half, I go through and I read the actual search phrases that people used to accidentally get to my site. So we'll start out here with the first shout out to me through Google. And I've got one good one here today that I'm going to read first. I've got to do this for my own ego, all right, because I get enough negative comments that it's always nice to get these. And it says, Rory Blythe is the coolest man ever, all right? Now, that's pretty nice stuff.
And that was the search? Somebody went to google.com and said this?
Yeah, but they know that it's going to get to me. See, people have caught on, and they've learned that they can communicate with me through Google. They know I'm going to look at my referral logs, and they know that it's going to show up in there. You'll get the hang of this as I go through the rest of the searches here.
That's an interesting way to make it through your spam filter, that's for sure.
It is fascinating. Yeah, so here's another one. I am the colon of Rory Blythe. I'm trying to figure... I mean, that's just nuts, right? I am the colon of Rory Blythe.
And the other one wasn't nuts enough.
Right. So I'm kind of looking at myself, and thinking... like, we're going to have to talk, colon. I don't really know how you got on the internet and typed that in the middle of the night while I was sleeping or whatever. Next one.
Well, wait, I have to know. Did he mean the part of the anatomy or the C-sharp language construct?
I think he meant the part of the anatomy. Let's just get real here, Chris. I mean... All
right. Well, I'm just...
You're stretching. You're stretching. This is like the avocado number thing. You're stretching too far, man.
Sorry, man.
No, it's okay. No harm done. Moving on. Man, I need to get Rory Blythe's site because I forgot the effing web address. I can't say the F word on the air because it would make me feel naughty, but it is in there. And this is an interesting way to find my site. Next one is, I blame Rory for monkey stink. I don't think that's my fault. I don't think I made the monkey stink, but I guess.
Chris liked who that was.
Chris liked that one. So we got another one here. Teach me Java, Rory Blythe. And you know what? That's no problem, right? So we'll start by setting up your class path. Do you have 3 hours to talk about this? Moving on. Is Rory Blythe Jesus? No, I just think I am, and it's totally different, okay? Not the same thing. Moving on. Rory Blythe is my role model. And you have good taste, my friend, but this is a dangerous path you tread. I don't know if I'd recommend it. And then here's one from somebody who's obviously been listening to a lot of Monty Python recently. And Chris, last night during the sound check, I'd like to point out that you told me that you have been listening to a lot of Monty Python recently. So maybe this has something to do with you. I don't know. Rory Blythe, I fart in your general direction, you wiper of other people's bottoms. So come on, Chris.
Or I shall taunt you a second time.
Yeah, see? You were too close on the follow-up there, Chris. That was obviously you. We'll just talk about that at the end of the show. Next one is I want to have Rory Blythe's children, and I can definitely help you try to do that. And then finally, here...
Wait. I think it's time for Google to start taking pictures as part of their search criteria. Right?
What do you mean exactly?
Someone who wants to have your children can submit, a resume.
Oh, no. This is like the Windows registry, Chris, I mean, it does one good thing at the beginning, and then eventually, 10 years later, it's being used to store, like, last night's chicken, so maybe we should just leave Google doing what it's doing now. And I know how you feel about the registry. I remember that post in the off-topic list about 8 months ago where you were asking what's wrong with storing extra things in the registry, and we all had a little difference of opinion there.
Yes, we did.
Yes, we did. So anyway, so here's the last shout out to Roy through Google, and this is the one that you guys have to own up to. Anybody who's trying to contact me through Google, this is the one to beat. All right, this one's long. Hi, Rory Blythe, what's happening? So I really like Google Weirdos. That's funny stuff. Do you think those super vegan people that won't eat veggies if it kills the plant would eat an iguana tail? I mean, it didn't kill the iguana.
Holy cow, that was a search?
That was a search, and it got to my site.
I think Google should tone such... I don't think they should accept that much text if they're not going to also accept pictures. I just think that's wrong.
You write Mr. Google a letter, okay? And CC it to your congressman.
You know what somebody could do, though?
Huh.
They could base 64 encode the picture.
I guess that is clever.
They can put that as part of the search string.
I'm Chris Sells. I'm so clever. Watch me be clever. That is clever. I like that. That's actually a really good idea. Somebody out there has to give that a shot. Well, actually, that's getting a little freaky. I mean, it's clever, but maybe just best left at home, That is clever, though. Bravo, Chris. I like that.
Well, it's not my first time.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to the not shout-outs. These are the actual Google weirdos. And they aren't always funny. Sometimes it's just sort of, what was this person thinking? Sometimes it's not all that weird. We just call Google weirdos because you need a name for branding so that later on you can stick it on Frisbees and lunchboxes and sell it to people, all right?
You mean those other people weren't the weirdos?
No, those are the normal people.
Oh my God.
No, but these next ones, you'll find that some of them really aren't that weird. It's just, sometimes you have to put a spin on it and make it a little weird yourself. All right, so the first search is Tammy Faye Baker crying, which I thought was a little redundant, right? I mean, is she ever not crying? Does the fountain ever shut off? She's just like a total constant, eternally weeping font. Moving on, we've got methadone freezing point. Now, that's a weird one because if you really need to know something like this, shouldn't you already have access to the information? The methadone. What do you need to know the methadone? You're asking Google what the methadone freezing point is?
I like the idea that Google is providing a home instruction kit for illegal activities as well as legal ones.
I wonder if maybe the idea here, I don't know how methadone is put together or whatever, or what it actually does, but maybe the person's kind of trying to isolate the methadone itself from whatever it's mixed in with. Now I'm probably just giving people ideas, so we should probably just move along. Got another one here. Sign a wife is cheating. And let me tell you, if she's got Neapolitan.com tattooed on her bottom, then she's probably cheating.
Wait a minute. All of these searches end up at your site?
Well, think about it, Chris. I mean, I write about absolutely everything. If I just wrote about .NET, then I get a lot of, like how to make C# go beep searches. But if you don't really limit yourself and you get everything from the whole colorful rainbow of life in there in your blog, then you're going to get all sorts of weird stuff.
Agreed.
Agreed.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So I cite my screen name. So this person is looking for their screen name for iChat and iCite on Google. Like they're just using Google as their own personal information repository. Probably a little disappointed when they didn't get anything back. That what I like about that is some searches just sort of tell you what the person is like. They tell you more about the person than they do about the thing that's being searched for, the search phrase. It's kind of interesting stuff.
Oh, wait a minute. All that told you was that person doesn't know how their computer works, which describes, frankly, most people with computers.
Google Weirdos is my segment.
I'm sorry. Too much color? That was too much color.
It was just the wrong kind of color. The color was black there, Chris.
Sorry.
Black, like your cold heart, like you were talking about earlier. All right, so we'll move along. Screw standards. And I got to say, this isn't really a weird thing, but sometimes I agree with it. Sometimes standards are a little bit frustrating. That's why I had to personally add variable support to CSS myself using an HTTP handler. Because I'm not going to wait for it. I'm not going to wait the next 10 years for everything to come through. Although I know I'm not supposed to say that, and I'm like a big bad guy for wanting to screw standards, but sometimes you just kind of have to take things into your own hands and, slap that horse on the ass right into the sunset and lay down the law. I don't know what any of that meant, but it's kind of how I feel about things. Next search is OneNote activation key. And all I have to say is I have forwarded your IP address to the Microsoft Special Pirate Interception Task Force. The guys in the black uniforms will be parachuting into your yard pretty soon and flying in through the windows. They'll take you away and nail you. Now, here is an honest-to-God Google weirdo. Picture of Carrot Top in lingerie with a Trojan monkey. Did you hear that, Chris?
I'm afraid to speak.
I mean, that's horrible. That's some pretty filthy, disgusting stuff.
Well, I'm still flabbergasted that all of these searches end up with your site, frankly.
It is a little
weird. Are you like the number one return for Carrot Top and his monkey?
Well, I'm guessing that I'm probably the number one return for picture of Carrot Top in lingerie with a Trojan monkey, because a person who's searching for something like that probably wants the first hit. They want the most relevant search. They want the most Carrot Top, the most lingerie, and the most Trojan monkey. They don't want the second largest amount of any of those ingredients. And Neapolitan offers that, We are bounteous in that area. Sounds like Chris is having some technical difficulties there on his end. And so the last Google Weirdo search of the day, and I know it's really sad, but we have to say bye every once in a while. The last Google Weirdo search of the day is draw stick people in Java. And all I have to say is it's fine if you want to draw your stick people in Java if you don't mind having really slow stick people. All right? So that's Google Weirdos for today, and I guess I'm going to hit the button here that Carl usually presses that plays the outro theme. Hang on. Weirdos, 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 weirdos. Yeah, out here in New London, we know how to have a good time.
Dude, I'm totally gonna quit my job and move to New London and beg to be the second string co-host. I mean, what you guys clearly do not work for a living.
Well, you realize, Chris, that if you come out here and you want to be, like the .NET Rocks guy, that you would probably displace me.
Oh,
but that's fine, because I could run the Longhorn Dev Center. I don't care.
No, I don't think so.
Are you saying you want to switch jobs like Freaky Friday?
I think we could. I think we could pay Jeff, the sound guy, and tie up Carl and put him in a closet, and that would be it.
Oh, I'm down with that.
All right. Yes. See,
that's not fair. That's not nice. God. All right, fine, whatever. So all sorts of weird plans to overthrow, this show and get Rory and Carl out of the picture and tie everybody up and light things on fire.
We have to keep Rory just for that fun Google Weirdos theme music.
Weird stuff. All right, so I guess it's about 40 minutes into the show, and now is the time when we would typically introduce the guest. Actually, this is the time when Carl would typically introduce the guest. So I'm going to do it for the very first time here. And hope that I do it all right. So the guest today is a SQL Server minded guru from New Zealand who recently transplanted himself to the magical, beautiful land of Australia, which is about 36 hours flight from any other point on the globe, including itself. And his name is Tony Bain. And I don't know if I mentioned that he was an MVP yet because I'm a little nervous. So I'm going to tell you right now, he's an MVP. So this is good stuff. And do we have Tony on the air?
Sure do.
Hey, Tony. All right. I do believe that the host would typically engage in a little bit of pre-interview banter with the guest. So I think it is my job to ask you, Tony, how's it going?
It's going well. Going well.
And what time is it down there in Australia?
It's coming up. It's 20 to 4, so a wee bit early. But
you said 20 to 4, as in 4 a.m.?
4 a.m., that's right.
Right, so you hear that, listeners? You hear what you did? Because you had to have your show, and you had to listen to it during your lunch break. Tony here had to stay up all night long, and he's still up, and the sun's just about to come up out there in Australia, and it's because of you that Tony has not slept tonight. But that's okay, because you're happy to be here, right?
I'm overjoyed to be here.
Overjoyed. All right, well, good stuff. So let's start. Let's talk a little bit about you. If I recall correctly, you run the Tony Bain Group, is that right, or the Bain Group?
That's right. Tony Bain Group is a company that I've been running for a while, which does SQL Server related consulting and training and bits and pieces.
Uh-huh.
And we also operate around Asia Pacific, mostly Australia and New Zealand, helping people out with their SQL Server issues, and in that we work quite a lot with developers and address the problems and
the issues therein, right?
issues there. And sure.
So when you say Asia Pacific to the geographically challenged, what does that mean exactly, Asia Pacific?
I guess it means Asia, Australia, and New Zealand.
So is that like another way of saying that you get to go do consulting jobs in the tropics?
It means I travel around quite a bit, yeah.
And you were up in New Zealand until about October, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I lived in New Zealand. I lived in one part and sort of travelled every day via plane to another part. It was quite interesting. I used to where I lived. It was 15 minutes to the airport, and then it was an hour by plane to where I worked.
Uh-huh.
So I used to get there within sort of an hour and a quarter. But since moving to Australia, I don't fly as much anymore, but spend 2 hours on the motorway. So
right.
it's been longer getting to work now.
Well, don't you just have one road in Australia that goes around the entire continent?
Pretty much, yeah.
So in New Zealand, back in New Zealand, were you ever were you an extra for Lord of the Rings? Did you have to put hair on your feet and wear the funny, foot slippers that make your feet look really big and wear a cape and stuff?
I didn't need them, no.
Right, okay, so you're never an extra. You were too busy. All right, well, that's good
I think what he was trying to say, Rory, is that he was an extra, but he didn't need the extra hair on his feet.
So you use your own hair. You didn't use a stunt double bit of hair or anything like that?
No, that's right. I was an orc.
Right. Well, good stuff. Okay, so why don't we start talking then about what it is that you do for a living and what kind of stuff you're interested in. I understand that you're kind of interested, for example, like let's just start from the beginning here. All right. Your focus is SQL Server, and you do a bit of talking and a bit of thinking about like database design, right? Now, I like to usually start at square one when I'm trying to understand an idea. So why don't we talk about good database design and what your opinions are on good database design?
Besides, you should have it.
Right.
Yeah, you should have one. Yes. Well, I talk about the issues I see people struggling with, and with database design, it's really at a simple level. You need to obviously have a design that meets what you're trying to do with that design. And an example is, operational, highly normalized databases. So databases with lots of tables and lots of relationships are good for storing and retrieving data from transaction processing systems.
Okay. But
they're not so good for retrieving large amounts of data for reporting purposes, because there's so many tables and joins involved that they can perform quite poorly. So, a different type of design is usually required to provide good, batch reporting than what is needed for operational systems. So
sure. Okay. Well, I hit you with a pretty broad question there, so let's drill down a little bit. A lot of developers are listening. That's pretty much what's going on here, and being someone who really knows this stuff pretty well, I'm sure that you would love to talk about some of the mistakes that you see, right? I wind up working at a lot of shops where the developers do the database design instead of DBAs or instead of people who are, for example, qualified. And what are some of the most common big blundering mistakes? Like if I'm a developer, I want to start designing databases, what are some things that you think I should avoid right off the bat if I'm going to be doing this for myself?
Okay. One of the biggest mistakes, I guess, is developers often create tables without primary keys.
Really?
Which is it's more common than what you think. In terms of database reviews, I do do them fairly regularly, and it's a very frequent. Sometimes they have some primary keys and some relationships, but then they sort of end up with all these sort of surrounding tables which don't have primary keys and relationships tied into anything.
Wait, you're actually finding a lot of databases out there where the tables have really been designed without any primary keys, and they're just treating these like flat files that have been grouped together in one common area?
Sure, it's pretty basic stuff, right? But it's fairly common, and quite often they intend there to be a primary key, but perhaps they just don't enforce it with constraint.
Oh, okay.
So that while they may have something which they think of as the primary key, it's not enforced. And of course, what that can lead to is duplicate rows within those tables. And also, without the primary key, without a unique key, then there's no way of enforcing referential integrity through foreign keys. So then you can end up with data in different tables, which is incorrectly linked.
Okay, so basically, big mistake number one is that a lot of developers are getting out there and they're designing their tables without primary keys. And if they are putting primary keys in, they are not using constraints to actually enforce any sort of rule. So, okay, well, that's good stuff to know.
And that kind of, I mean, one of the, I guess, fundamental principles of relational databases, there is no order in a table. So one row is not, not the third row in a table, right? There's no actual order of rows in the table logically. So without an enforced constraint, well then it's it isn't conceivably possible to identify an individual row. That if you've got two rows with the same data,
then
there's
busted.
no way there's no way to select one particular occurrence of that without a unique key of some form. So it's not a good situation to be in. Yeah,
I actually learned about that the hard way in doing some development on my own, and just kind of being lazy on a Sunday afternoon and forgetting to actually add any primary keys. And when it comes time to delete your data and you have anything that's looking, at all similar, when you have duplicate data there in your rows, it gets a little bit tough, They don't really want to go deleting your data. Okay, so that's big mistake number one. Do you have another item that you're seeing when you're going around?
Rory?
Sure.
Yeah, Chris.
I'm sorry. Could I just ask just a quick question
Chris,
about
you can jump
the
in.
primary thing?
You can jump in whenever you want. And
okay.
Yeah.
Well then, hush.
Right.
So Tony, I have to ask. I mean, I can see where people would build a table without building a primary key at all, right? But how? I mean, is it the case that people are just writing SQL scripts by hand and forgetting to put the constraints in the primary key? Because any of the design tools I've ever used for designing tables, if I say this is the primary key, the little dialog box that comes up is by default, items in this or rows in this column must be unique in the primary key. So people have to actually be checking that checkbox off to turn off the constraint checking.
In terms of databases out there running on SQL Server, there are, I guess, there's several categories or scales, if you like, and our big projects with lots of developers and design teams. I mean, this situation is less common, but then there's a heck of a lot of one or two developer teams who don't use any particular design tool, who create tables just in Enterprise Manager or via SQL scripts. And, it's not thought of as an issue. Now, I mean, it's a fairly simple thing, right? But the reason I bring it up is because it is very, very common to go through and actually to review the database and find that they may have started off with good intentions, but as they just quickly added new tables to do this and the table here to do that, they sort of left those off or not knowing what was the primary key at the time, so they didn't worry about it. And then you generate a database diagram, and there's like 5 tables which sort of sit at the core, which are nicely linked in a normalized design, and then you've got 150 tables sort of spread horizontally across the diagram, which just sort of hanging out in the breeze. So it's just
pretty messy.
I think everyone knows, and every time I do the review and say, well, you should have primary keys on your tables, everyone goes, yeah, we know that, but we haven't done it for this reason. So it's really an important thing to get on there as soon as you create the table, so that you can ensure that your primary keys they're working for you, keeping the rows unique, so you can always reference a particular row. Now, I mean, there may be cases. Sometimes people say, well, if it's just a log table, we just want to shove stuff in there. We don't really care about a primary key. Well, there may be exceptions, but generally all tables should have the primary key.
I like the idea, though, going back of someone deciding to hand code the script and shunning the tools and saying, that's just for kids, and then just completely botching everything up and not getting keys on anything. I like that idea. It's sort of like poetic justice, and it keeps you busy, right?
Well, it's like the SQL Server Continuing Employment Act, right?
Yeah, guaranteed employment. Okay, so does that basically answer your question, Chris?
It does. Thank you.
Great. And so big blundery thing number 2. You have another thing on the list after primary keys that developers typically do when designing their databases?
I guess number 2 is generally every table should have a clustered index.
Right.
Now, the reason being is if you've got a primary key, then you have an index. The primary key comes with an index. It's a constraint with the index built in, if you like. So that when you create a primary key, you've got at least one index on a table. Now that can be a clustered index or a non-clustered index. And just quickly, the difference between a clustered index is that the actual rows of the table are logically sorted by the order of the index, whereas a non-clustered index is just a separate structure, and the actual rows of the table aren't ordered by the non-clustered index. But the clustered index is typically the most efficient type of index. So if you've got at least one index, that one index should be a clustered index. Now, there may be cases where you have lots of indexes, and one of those can be the clustered one, and it may not be the primary key. But if the case is if your table's just got one index, it should be a clustered index in most situations.
All right, so that's big blunder number 2 is not using a clustered index. And
Sure.
and the real hit for not doing that is probably performance, right? I mean, that's what we're looking at? Or?
Yeah, performance. Now, I mean, things that relate to performance only really kick in once we're sort of getting over the 100,000 row table size.
But it's just generally a good guideline, a good design principle.
Sure.
Okay, great.
Sure.
And do you have anything else you'd want to add to the list? Like things, people like things that come in threes, right?
Sure. Well, I guess the third big blunder is people not spending enough time thinking about the actual data types and nullabilities of columns.
Sure.
For example, I've recently reviewed some databases which may have tables with 10 million rows in it, and in a column they've gone for an int data type when a tiny int would have been sufficient.
Right.
So they've got 3 extra bytes in a column. So over 10 million rows, I think it works out to about 30 meg of space sort of consumed in that table, which doesn't need to be. And obviously that has impact in terms of how many rows fit within a page in SQL Server and how many rows can be retrieved in per I/O request. So it has ongoing effects in terms of performance. Spend more time thinking about the actual size of the columns, what type of data is going to be stored in there. Bearing in mind that if situations change, we can always expand data types much more easily than you can restrict them.
Yeah, and I mean the implications are kind of all across the board anyway. Because when I was first getting started, I'll admit I was guilty of this. I created first of all, do you like to say varchar or varchar? What do they say on that side of the universe down there in Australia?
I'd say varchar, but
I say varchar too, so we can agree on that. You eat Vegemite. Do you eat Vegemite?
We Vegemite, yeah.
Okay, you eat Vegemite? Okay, I can't agree with that, but I'll agree with you on the pronunciation of varchar. So one thing I was guilty of doing when I started out was I created a date column, and I used varchar as the type. And maybe this is me just kind of like trying to cleanse, trying to get this off my chest, kind of trying to unload this burden that I've been carrying around for a long time. And I learned the very hard way why it's important to select your data types carefully and do it intelligently. I mean, I don't know if you ever tried to search a varchar column like that. It's not so much fun. But, and
especially for things like globalization, storing a date in a varchar column, it's not going to do any of the reformatting and it's necessary. So
let's not beat around the bush. I mean, it was just stupid. It was not a good choice. It was a foolish thing for me to have done. And I'm sure I'm not the only one on earth who's done it. In fact, I know I'm not because I've encountered other databases where people have done similar things. So big blunder number 3 then is not really thinking about your data types and the way that you're creating them and your columns. So that's a good deal. All right, so that's 3 good items right there. So
Tony,
sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
At the interest of putting all programmers and consultants around the world out of work with tools, which is my continuing interest, because I'm just too lazy to do anything more than once. Is there any tool out there, like, are you familiar with FXCOP that will, like, check your .NET classes against a set of rules?
Oh, huh.
Sure.
Is there like an SQL cop that can, like, check for primary keys and tell you, hey, none of your data needs to be int in this column, why don't you make it tiny int and you'll save 30 megabytes? Or, hey, watch the searches and say, gosh, you're searching a lot on varchar, why don't you make it, car or whatever? I mean, are there any tools out there that can look at your tables and look at your usage and make recommendations on changes you could make to tune things?
There may very well be, but certainly not any that I know of that are in widespread use.
That sounds like magic you could bottle and sell.
There are a bunch of tool vendors popping up, but no, I don't know of any sort of major tool out there with that functionality.
Well, Tony, that idea is yours. It's just you, me, and Rory here. No one else is listening. That one's secret. Tony, if you want it,
that's what I was just thinking. How many $1 million ideas are given away on this show each week? I mean, that was pretty good. Assuming it could really be done well.
I imagine someone may have. There are a bunch of tool developers out there who are coming up with some of these nifty tools for SQL Server. So there may be one of those out there who have done that. So perhaps they could post a link or something after the show.
So how can DBAs help out? Like where all this stuff is going on? I mean, what should be going on here? What should DBAs be doing? I mean, they should be DBAing, right?
Yeah, that's
wait a minute. DBAs, the job of a DBA is not to help.
The job of a DBA is to hang the red tape, right?
Yeah, the job of the DBA is to say, hey, you're not allowed to touch this data in that way.
Yeah. It used to be, and it used to be pleasant that way, didn't it? The DBA was the fed one, who would sit in the corner, and any time anyone came to talk to them about the database, they would turn around and make an angry face and
chop one of your fingers off. Yeah, the good old days.
Huh? It's not like that anymore. DBAs are now skilled in the art of customer service and are measured on their performance levels and meeting user requirements. So it's changed.
It's a tough world for them now. Yeah.
It is. So the role of the DBA is more, I guess, for the developer consultative role. I know a lot, some developers like to develop in isolation, but really the people who sort of understand, I guess, the production issues of development for SQL Server are the DBAs. So there's certainly a good place to start in terms of building some knowledge about the things you have to worry about, such as when you're developing code in I guess your development environment, you're not really thinking about the types of things which may happen in production, such as what happens if the server fails, what happens if if you're if there's five other users doing something else at the same time. So it's their role has sort of changed more into sort of.
They're not just data cops anymore, right? Yeah,
no, they're more of a review process for things going through into the production environments, and most of the DBAs I know also sort of provide sort of a second level assistance now to developers in terms of helping them with their SQL, helping them with optimization, and design issues. So.
Cool. So I hate to interrupt, but first of all, Chris, you have to remember this. I'm telling you something. You got to remember it. Okay.
Okay.
System.rory.isnervous. You'll understand later on. And the other thing I wanted to say is that in some of the comments we're getting from listeners right now, Chris James says that Microsoft has a best practices analyzer tool that you can run against SQL Server databases.
Really?
So maybe it's just buried deep, capital D, deep in some website somewhere, and we can find it.
Does he provide a link or something?
He does not. Hey, Chris, if you're out there and you're still listening, if you could do our dirty work for us and find that link and submit it back to us through the .NET Rock suggestion thing, or through the comments.
I think it's available from Microsoft.com/SQL. Best practice analyzer is a very good tool, actually. I think it does actually address some of those design issues. It's not specifically a design review tool. It's a tool you sort of point at a SQL Server and it'll go off and it'll check sort of a bit of everything. Look at the server config, or look at the security, I think, and it looks at some of the design issues. So it's a general best practice tool for SQL Server. So it may do some of those design issues as well.
Okay. All right. Well, that's good stuff. So we're hitting the 1 hour mark, which means that now is a time when we're going to have to play a word from our sponsor and a couple songs. So why don't you guys just hang out, and I'm going to get the music started, and you can get up and stretch a little bit. You've probably got just a few minutes here, so keep an eye or keep an ear on what's happening. Once the music stops, we'll be back on the air. Is that okay, guys?
Yeah.
Great. So we'll be right back.
Hey, Carl Franklin here, giving a shout out to my friends at Data Dynamics. We've talked a lot about Active Reports on this show, and this is no exception. So I'm talking about ActiveReports.net. This is a port of their popular Active Reports program. If you're currently thinking of doing reporting in .NET for Windows Forms or web applications, check out Active Reports for .NET. Many of my friends in the business use and swear by ActiveReports.net. I use it as well. Let me just tell you, to say that the reporting is simple does it an injustice, because it makes you think that it can only do simple things. It can do very powerful things, but you don't have to go through hoops just to set up a simple report. When you create a report, the report exists with your application, okay? It doesn't exist on a server somewhere. All right, we're not talking about enterprise reporting. We're talking about, I have some data, I want to print it out, or I want to show it to the user. PDF format is supported, HTML format is supported. All the great features you'd expect from a reporting engine, drop dead simple, and the best part, it's not going to break the bank. They have a great licensing scheme that's easy to deal with. So check it out at www.datadynamics.com. Now let's get back to our show.
Well, let it rain, let it pour, let it rain a whole lot more, 'cause I got them deep river blues. Just let the rain drive right on, let the waves just sweep along. Yes, I got them deep river blues. Now my old gal, she's a good old pal. She looks just like a waterfowl when I get them river blues. I ain't no one to cry for me, and the fish all go out on a spree when I get them deep river blues. Just giving me back my old boat, I'm gonna sail her if she'll float, 'cause I got them deep river blues. Yeah, I'm going back to muscle shows. Times are better there, I'm told, 'cause I got them deep river blues. Now let it rain, let it pour, let it rain a whole lot more, 'cause I got them deep river blues. Just let that rain drive right on, let the waves sweep along, 'cause I got them deep. If my boat sinks with me, I'll go down, don't you see, 'cause I got them deep river blues. And now I'm gonna say goodbye, and if I sink, just let me die, 'cause I got them deep river blues. So let it rain, let it pour, let it rain a whole lot more, 'cause I got them deep blues. Let the rain just drive right on, let the waves sweep along, 'cause I got them deep river blues. Yes. go. I didn't get a message, didn't find a wanted note. You came the way you entered, silent through the door. God, what I give for another minute more. And waiting and crawling and begging and beating your door. And your door. And your
Hello. All right, so we're back. Got the sponsor word in there and a couple songs from Carl and I, like we usually like to do. And I gotta say, I learned during the break that my armpits have been sweating a whole lot more than they usually do when I'm just co-hosting. So, Chris, you there?
What did you do during the break that made this obvious to you?
I was just walking around and I noticed a distinct clammy sensation in the general area of the armpits. How are your pits? They're probably nice and dry because, you talk in front of people all the time and for you it's no big deal and you're the co-host and I know from experience that co-hosting leaves your armpits not quite as sweaty.
Actually, I am a little sweaty, but only because I'm hot, not because I'm nervous. Sorry.
Oh, okay. All right. Tony, how about you? How are you doing in the pits?
Pretty dry over this side.
Okay. All right. Well, that's good. Now everybody knows. Nice, good, high-quality technical content there.
I'm glad SQL Server is making Chris hot. So.
All hot and bothered. In fact,
Yeah.
I'm so hot and bothered that I went and found that FX cop for SQL Server thing and posted it on my blog on salesbrothers.com. So you can just go and download it now and put yourself out of work if you like, Tony.
I'd also like to say that Carl out in Indiana, him and all his students, he says their pits are dry out there. So we basically covered all our bases. We know the general moisture level of everybody's armpits now, so you can probably move on with the show. So during the first pre-ad spot portion of the show, we talked a bit about some of the things that developers do wrong, some of the mistakes they make, and how DBAs can help in that area. So right now, why don't we talk about something that's kind of sexy, right? Let's talk about like the bling bling of the SQL Server world, which right now is Yukon. So let's talk first about what impact you think Yukon is going to have.
To me, Yukon is about enabling SQL Server to do perform new roles that it's currently not performing. I think with SQL Server 2000, the sort of current set of functionality of the relational database is fairly good. I mean,
Right.
Everyone who's using SQL Server 2000 is not sort of struggling or crying out for a bug
Yeah.
fix or a enhancement to that for the particular set of functionality that it has.
It does its job as a relational database well, basically.
It does its
Yeah.
job as a relational database, and it does that very well. I mean, I think 2000 was almost 12 months before the first service pack came out, and I had clients sort of running it in production on beta 2. So it's had a history of being very reliable and very solid.
It's been great. So what is Yukon going to add to the mix, and how's that going to change the universe?
Hopefully it won't
I think
affect the whole cool reliability thing.
That's a good point. Chris just said he hopes it doesn't violate the whole reliability thing, but
Sure. It seems that they're putting effort into getting it right. It's not been shipped out the door before it's ready. Well, the main topic of relevance for this audience is, of course, the inclusion of the .NET runtime
Sure.
within SQL Server.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's traditionally when developers were forced to write all their stored procedures and functions in T-SQL, they now have the option of creating code which runs within SQL Server in the .NET language.
Sure. And what do you think about that? Because I've talked to a lot of different people, and we all talk about how cool it sounds, like in theory, but in reality, how widely applicable is this going to be? Is it going to be good for any place where we're using a stored procedure in the past, or is this going to be something we're going to want to use just for certain specific niche purposes? I mean, at least right off the bat, this is the first release with an embedded CLR. So
Sure. My role is I guess I'm almost 50% developer and 50% DBA. So half of me says, "Hey, this is really, really cool," and the other half of me saying, "Oh, no."
Right. Yeah.
So it's something people are going to have to learn how to use, and
Sure.
it's certainly, I don't think, going to replace T-SQL. T-SQL, I think, will remain the dominant way in which we query the relational database, so our SQL statements and some T-SQL for the procedural part of those,
Okay.
constructing the logic around what particular SQL statements we issue. And the way I see the .NET code being involved is to push some of that, I guess, the data-centric logic, such as specific functions or routines that operate on that data that aren't needed in the application level down into the database engine, such as if you have a function or a procedure which uses a lot of data and outputs a particular, a much smaller result. So it consumes many rows and outputs a smaller result set as it's processed that data. Well, then it may be a good opportunity to sort of save on network bandwidth, reduce sort of the lag time between machines by pushing some of that logic into the database engine and allowing it to operate on all that larger amount of data natively, and then only passing sort of the process results across the wire to the client machine.
Okay, so in a way, it's going to help us cut down on round trips.
That's right. It allows us to centralize sort of data-centric processing within the database. So stuff which is, hitting the database heavily can be pushed right back actually into the database.
Okay.
But we do that today now already, right? With T-SQL and stored procs. How is the .NET stuff really going to be different?
We do it with T-SQL and stored procs, but T-SQL is not the language of choice for application developers. People who have experience with C# can much easier sort of crank out sort of C# code to do what they want rather than having to write that sort of same sort of procedural logic within T-SQL. And of course the code within .NET is compiled as well. So.
Sure. And what are some of the performance implications? I mean, this isn't something we're going to just want to dive into, hairy-carry just all over the place, dropping .NET code all over the place, are we? I mean, this is something we're going to have to think about at least right off the bat, I'm guessing.
Sure, and I guess we're probably not at that point yet. I guess we're not at public beta yet with it, so that the actual performance numbers, they haven't been crunched, if you like. So there's obviously going to be performance impacts, some good, some bad. And weighing up the sort of the benefits against the disadvantages. That's the sort of the DBA side of me, which is sort of has the reservations. Is there's going to be, I guess, a teething period when people are getting used to what works well and what's probably best left as T-SQL stored procedures.
Okay.
I love the idea of developers around the world kind of gnawing on the SQL Server Yukon box when they get it.
Yeah, because I know that my first instinct when I heard about this was, I'm just going to stop coding in T-SQL. I'm just going to start dropping little C# stored procedures all over the place. But obviously, that's not going to be the best idea right off the bat.
Well, I assume that there, just like any languages, right? There are things that are better suited to .NET, which is why the Yukon team has decided to do this work at all.
Right.
But I'm sure that there are things that are still better suited to T-SQL. Tony, do you have a sense of what those things might be?
I guess if you're not doing a lot of non-database computation, such as if you're selecting data from here, updating it here, deleting something here, well then that's essentially a bunch of just SQL statements, right? So you can embed those in a standard T-SQL stored procedure with a bit of procedural logic, but you're not actually going to benefit from putting that same logic in C# because it's not doing a lot of work other than the actual SQL statements, right? And the SQL statements, when you write it in C#, you still use SQL statements to actually go off and hit the database and update things, right?
Really? Okay.
So you're just sort of moving the sort of the procedural surrounds from T-SQL to C#, which is going to buy you very little. However, if you're doing things like, I guess the common example is sort of string matching, regular expressions, or that sort of thing is very, very difficult to do in T-SQL today. Right. Languages such as VB.NET, it's much easier and much more powerful. So I guess it's that interpretation, computation that there aren't native SQL functions for. You may benefit from doing that within a .NET procedure or function.
Okay. And so going even a little bit further, you're working on a Yukon book right now, aren't you? Can you talk about that at all? Or is that sort of off limits?
I'm working on a book which is due out in July to sort of coincide around the time that the public beta is out. That's called Yukon Revealed from APress.
Uh-huh.
And that's kind of, I mean, it's DBA focused to prepare people for SQL Server when it comes out in full release. So it's not a end-to-end book. It's more about taking people who are familiar with SQL Server today, sort of teaching them what's coming in Yukon and actually getting how to get them prepared so that when the release version comes out, they can know which parts of .NET they have to become familiar with. Because bearing in mind that for developers, it may be a natural progression, but for DBAs, they're going to have to become familiar with things like, the .NET framework to actually start to understand these new things which are happening inside their database engine. So it's kind of a large learning curve for DBAs. Well,
sure. I mean, we were talking before the break about how they didn't even really have to make use of the A in the acronym, right? They didn't really even have to administer anything. They just sort of stood there and said, tell it to the hand. And then we dropped all this responsibility on them. And now this, too. I mean, this is coming along. We've talked about how Yukon is going to benefit the .NET developer, but you're writing this book for DBA. So can you talk about some of the features that are going to make life better or easier just from the pure SQL point of view? Are there going to be any changes, or are we basically just getting like a SQL Server 2000 with a .NET CLR in it?
So that's sort of one of the killer features. But of course, with every release, there's new enhancements, there's new T-SQL commands. I think a lot of effort has been put into bringing the syntax of everything into a common standard and in line with these SQL standards. So there's been a lot of change on the standard feature set and improvement and inclusion of the new sort of SQL standards. I mean, as you may know, SQL is sort of driven by the ANSI SQL standards.
Right.
And they're changing, and the next version will obviously have some of those new ANSI SQL standard commands, etc., and within the SQL command set.
So it's time for the Linux vulnerability of the week.
Hello, Mr. Bull. Let's you and me fight.
Okay, and I have to explain a little bit about what this is. This is Carl's invention, and it's a good idea. The idea here is that Linux is not, bad. It's not better than Windows. Windows is not necessarily bad or better than Linux in terms of security, right? Everybody has holes. Everybody makes mistakes. So this week, because it's sort of a weird show and it's sort of a weird time, and Carl's away in Indiana, and the air is just a little bit different around here, I'm going to do a slightly different thing for the Linux vulnerability of the week. Instead of naming an actual vulnerability, this week I want to talk about something else, okay? This week's Linux vulnerability is not in your code. It's not a missing semicolon that brings down the whole system, right? It's not a compiling issue. It's not a versioning problem. It's not a Stack Overflow or whatever that mumbo jumbo is. All right, this week, the Linux vulnerability, it's in your heart. Okay, it's in your heart. Okay, I've been following this guy, Christopher Anthony, who's been kind of picking on Carl and I a little bit for the past few weeks about how we support Microsoft and about how we really like Microsoft and this and that. And we wound up getting into some pretty heated arguments. You probably heard us talking about them either here or on our blogs. And in the course of the arguments, I kind of learned how little Christopher really knew about Microsoft and about Microsoft Windows. From the company point of view, of course, he thinks that Microsoft is this big, evil, horrible thing. Although he seems to...
of course in the middle of that sentence.
Well, that's what all the open source. Well, that's what a lot of the open source. Well, that's what the really vocal kind of pesky open source people think. All right, and they're always big for Sun. They talk about how great Sun is, or this or that, anything but Microsoft. And they totally ignore the fact that Bill Gates has $24 billion slated for charity and is kind of taking world health into his own hands, but that's another issue. We're not going to bring that up here. So I learned how little he really, really knew about Microsoft. And he still wanted to argue about it. He still wanted to argue against it and kind of talk a bit of smack and talk about how Windows was such a bad operating system and about how coding for Windows is like back in the Stone Ages and this and that. He was actually just listening to the show to get Mono information. He wanted to learn a little bit about Mono. And so as the conversation continued, I was honest with him. I said, look, Chris, you're hurting your side here. You're coming out, you're speaking against Microsoft, and you're speaking against Windows. You're speaking for open source and for Linux. But the problem is, you know so little about Microsoft, and you say so many things that are just patently false and wrong that you're damaging your own credibility. I said, what you need to do is you need to get out there and learn a little bit about Microsoft products, about Windows and this and that. And he kind of took me up on it. And he's been going through for the past few days, and he's installed Windows XP. He got himself a copy of VisualStudio.net, and he's experiencing Windows sort of for the first time. Not so much as a collection of rumors and whispers and negative comments in IRC channels around the world, hearing things from his friends. For example, one thing he had heard from a friend was that Windows Media Player didn't play MP3s, right? Like Microsoft would be that stupid and not support the most popular compressed audio format in the universe right now. Just a lot of really bad information like that. So in a way, the vulnerability here was that he wasn't willing to actually get outside of his camp and take a look at what was going on the other side of the fence, right? And just like security issues, I think that's sort of a problem for developers everywhere, or for advocates of any given technology anywhere. So when I talk about Linux and I say the occasional bad thing, I'm talking from the point of view of someone who's actually worked with it and actually done a bit of coding on it and actually installed it and run different distros, and I actually even wrote a textbook on it at one point. I've sort of been there, and I think it strengthens the argument. So the Linux vulnerability of the week then is not looking on the other side of the fence even when you want to talk about it, and that's something that I encounter unfortunately a lot in people who are attacking Microsoft and trying to promote Linux. Sort of makes everything look kind of bad. Linux vulnerability, I suppose. There's probably like some nice ancient Greek tragic term for it. Then is that sort of weakness.
So you were kind of like the wise older statesman, kind of reaching across the political divide over to the enemy camp and putting your arm around Chris and saying, "Listen, Chris, you can have your own opinion, but you really need to have all the information first."
Right. That's exactly what it was. If he comes out the other end and he has nothing to say except, oh, Windows stinks and I can't stand VisualStudio.net, then at least he has some experience. At least he has something on which to base that. Although, fortunately, if you read his blog, chrisanth.blogspot.com, it doesn't look like it's turning out that way. He still talks a bit of trash, and he still calls everybody names and everything, but that's kind of going on both sides of the fence. He's still pushing along, and he's still giving all this stuff a try, so he'll come out the other end at least informed with experience. And it's a pretty cool thing. He's getting a lot of help from a lot of Microsoft people. Not people from Microsoft necessarily, but people in the community who are very familiar with .NET and very familiar with what's going on. So it's a good way to start. And reading his blog is an interesting way to see Windows for the first time through the eyes of someone who has never used it, really, but has talked a lot about it. So that is the Linux vulnerability of the week. Little different, not the usual stuff, but neither is this show today.
Hello, Mr. Bull. Let's you and me fight.
Okay, so Tony, you still there?
Sure.
Great. So let's get back to SQL Server then. Let's bring it kind of full circle. We talked about Yukon. We talked a bit about your book. You wanna get a little more technical here for a minute and give us some tips on maybe other optimizations that people can make use of for their SQL Server installs?
I guess performance optimization is the topic that most people are concerned with.
Right.
I guess the key point is no magic button. I've often seen developers come with like 1,300-line SQL statements and say it's slow. Can you fix the server?
Yeah, what's wrong with it?
We'll just change that go slow setting to go a bit faster.
Yeah.
I guess in terms of percentages, from my experience, I guess there's about a 5% change in performance possible if you tinker with server settings. All right. So
Okay.
you may be able to change the configuration, perhaps change a bit of some of the sizing, change some of the database options. You may be able to get a 5% change by doing that. Okay. So that's really what you can get from the server. You may get up to, say, a 50% performance improvement by perhaps changing the hardware. And that's assuming that you've got reasonable hardware to start with.
Sure.
And you may get some performance by adding more memory, more CPU, more disk. But the key thing there, by adding hardware to fix a performance problem, typically if it's a bottleneck relating to data size, well then over time that bottleneck will reappear and you'll be getting into the cycle of adding more hardware to keep
Right.
sort of the performance at a level which is acceptable.
The Sun solution.
Yeah,
it's running Java, throw more hardware at it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess the sort of the 10,000%, the N% performance improvement comes from understanding the logic that you're doing, the queries that you're doing, and reworking your SQL. And I'm not saying that you can always get that level of performance improvement, but in terms of the relative scales of what you can achieve, there's significantly more performance to be gained by reworking your SQL, re-optimizing, looking at sort of the way the SQL's been processed, looking at indexes, looking at the amount of data that you're operating on compared with, say, changing server settings. So it's just trying to give a bit of perspective of where's best to spend the time.
Sure. So like cutting down your store procedures to 1,200 lines, for example.
That's right. Well, I mean, it really comes from understanding what's going on, what SQL Server does when you submit a batch for its process. And I mean, SQL Server is a cost-based optimizer. So when you submit a SQL statement, it goes through this process called optimization, which is really a set of rules which are built into the database engine, which goes through and evaluates different strategies for processing that query. Now, with cost-based optimization, it does this by running these rules and assigning associated costs with every step that it would need to do in a particular plan. Now, then for complex queries, there may be thousands of different ways of actually processing the query. So things that it takes into consideration are what indexes to use, what tables to look at, how to join tables together, what to do first, what order to do things, when to sort things, when to join things together, and each combination of these things is called a plan, and the optimizer will go through and assign a cost, and then choose the plan with the sort of least associated cost.
Okay.
So the optimizer is not always perfect, though, because with very complex queries, there may be thousands of different combinations. For it to actually go and look at all those different combinations, it could take longer than actually to run the query itself. So it uses, I guess, the set of rules, the IP of the database engine, to sort of whittle down to a pretty good plan as quickly as it can. So it sort of uses these rules to say, well, I think this type of query plan is going to be good enough, and that's how it selects what to operate with.
And what about some other optimization steps that can be taken? Like, what about set no count, for example?
Sure. Well, I guess there's a whole bunch of things, and set no count is one of them, which really impacts the sort of the network bandwidth, right? It's relevant if you've got lots of statements within a stored procedure which send back the number of rows returned to the client. If you've got lots of statements in stored procedure, setting no count on suppresses that that number of rows retrieve message from going back to the client and causing a network round trip. Now, it doesn't sound a lot, but if you've got perhaps a large batch which is processing many thousands of statements in a loop or something, it can be quite significant. I think I did a demonstration somewhere where I showed I had a piece of code which fires off as many batches as possible on like 100 threads concurrently to a server, and then measures the number of batches that it could do within a sort of like 30 seconds. And by having set node count on, it could do about 3,000. And by turning that off, it could do, I think, 7,000 to 10,000. So that extra network load was quite significant for when you have a large number of, for things like a website, we have a large number of perhaps concurrent hits and consuming the network bandwidth. Other things to think about is in your select lists, okay? Sure. People quite often do select star. But select star is bad for a few reasons, but the main reason why it's not so good is because select star means to get all the columns, obviously, which means that pretty much the either the base table or the cluster index has to be looked at to get all the column values. Now, if you actually revise that and only select the relevant columns that you need, SQL Server may be able to get the data from perhaps an index without actually touching the base table. So by just by reducing the column lists down to the actual columns you need, you can avoid steps within the query plan, which you may not even be aware that are occurring.
So just by doing that, basically,
Just by doing that, you can get performance benefits straight away. Okay, if you've got select star everywhere and you're bringing back 50 columns when you only need 2,
if your store procedure is just 1,300 lines of select star, for example.
Yeah, so it's not just a bandwidth issue; it's actually a way in which that query is processed.
Right.
Is affected by the fact that that by saying "give me every column," the SQL Server may have to look somewhere else to get that data than where it needs to look if you're only getting perhaps 2 columns. So.
Sure, there's fine-tuning to be done everywhere along the way, basically, in reducing network chitter-chatter and ensuring that the processing isn't going to be too heavy-duty, just kind of whittling away every place you possibly can. So what about like connection pooling?
Connection pooling is good, I guess, for middle tier type environments where you have a common user which is continuously submitting connection requests. I guess connection pooling is important to note that it's a client-side process. SQL Server doesn't know anything about connection pooling. Okay. All it knows about is the connections that it has open to it, whether they're in a connection pool or not. It doesn't know about, so it's completely a client-side process, right?
Okay.
Now, but it is particularly relevant for when you have large number of connection requests. If I mention that demo I did with this code which fires off as many requests as possible within a time frame, with connection pooling, with that off, for one particular example, I was able to submit sort of 3,000 requests to SQL Server. Each time it would open a new connection, so which involves network round trip. So it's got a handshake, it's got to authenticate, and then it's got to establish a connection. So with connection pooling off, we could do 3,000, but by turning connection pooling on, we were able to do something like 48,000 requests within that same period, just because the fact that it doesn't have to do all this extra work. Obviously, this is a sort of an insulated example, but it's that scale of performance impact which is possible by having the connections in the pool, especially when you're having a large number of those sort of client requests occurring very frequently.
Sure. Okay, so that's good stuff. So early on in the show, we talked about a lot of the big mistakes that developers make when designing their own databases and their own tables and things. So let's bring it back to the developers. What are some things that you find developers kind of struggle with? Right, people coming from procedural languages like C# and VB.NET, when they're kind of coming over to the SQL side of the world, what are some of the things they have a really hard time with? Well,
the biggest issue is that people see SQL Server as this black box which sort of goes off and does this stuff, and they don't really know what's going on.
Isn't that what it does?
So they have a stored procedure, and they may execute it, and it may take, it takes 60 seconds to execute. And they have to optimize it, and they don't really know where to start.
Right.
All they know is, they asked it to run, it took 60 seconds, and then they got the result back. So they sort of open it up and go through statement by statement, just sort of changing stuff, trying to make it faster.
Right.
And I guess the key message I always tell developers when we first start talking about SQL Server is it's by no means this sort of black box which doesn't tell you what's going on. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Everything which sort of happens in SQL Server, you can see very easily and actually pinpoint very, very quickly where time and effort is going within a batch of SQL statements.
So how do we get in there and actually see that? I mean, what do we do, really?
Okay, well, the easiest way is within Query Analyzer, you turn on Show Execution Plan.
Uh-huh.
When you turn on Show Execution Plan and execute a query, okay, you'll get the query will run, you'll get the result, but also down the bottom you'll get an execution plan pane. If you flick to that, you will see a graphical representation of all the steps that SQL Server's taken to actually take your request and execute it and retrieve the result.
And so, what does it look like a flow chart or sort of like a tree view or?
Yeah, I guess it's like a tree of not only the queries that are executed, but the individual steps that it took or individual tasks that it did per query, sort of internally to actually process the query. So it says, well, I had to look at this index, and then I had to do this type of join type to this index, to then I joined the result together, and then I grouped it, and then I spat it out to you. So you get a tree view of what's going on, but the most important thing that you get there is the cost stamps.
Sure.
Okay. So if I've got a stored procedure which may have 15 SQL statements in, and I execute that, and it takes 60 seconds, just by looking at the execution plan, I get a relative cost of every SQL statement within that stored procedure. So I can see straight away, hey, this my sixth SQL statement, for example, is taking 95% of the cost of that execution. Okay. So straight away, I know that, well, if I'm optimizing this, I only need to look at this statement. If I can optimize that, I've got potentially 95% of the current cost or the current, cost gain. So right away, instead of scrolling through the SQL code, just changing stuff and hoping that it's going to get faster, I know exactly which statement to look at.
Sure. I think that's actually. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry. No, you go.
Well, I was just going to say that I think that's a common thing for developers to do, right? They try to optimize without even testing where the bottlenecks might be in the code.
Sure.
It happens all the time.
It's extremely common. Extremely common. It's just not obvious straight away that this information is available. It's right there, and it's very easy to get. Mm-hmm. So not only do I get which query to look at, but the execution plan for each task within inside that query, it has associated cost to that. So I find out query 6 taking 95% of the cost. I can also see that the lookup on this particular table is taking perhaps 70% of the cost of that. So not only do I know which query to look at, I know which particular part of the query to look at to optimize it, to reduce that costing down. So it's very, very simple, but it's probably the biggest unnecessary time waster is that people sort of sit there and sort of change things and try and optimize sort of SQL like in the dark almost without.
Well,
really
it's almost like superstition. It's almost like doing a rain dance and hoping that there's actually going to be a change, right?
Sure.
Okay, so one of the keys then to optimizing and to being a good SQL developer is knowing how to use the tools to really isolate where the bottlenecks are so that you can whack appropriately instead of just whacking here, whacking there, and possibly even in the process introducing further complications and further bottlenecks because you didn't know what you were doing, right?
Sure.
Okay.
That's right. I mean, the execution plans are complex in that they show you the exact detail what SQL Server is doing.
Sure.
But you can ignore that if you like and just look at the percentages, and at least you've got a fairly precise point at where to start.
Yeah.
You don't need to understand exactly what's going on. If you just look at the percentages, you can say, okay, it's this one. Right?
Yeah, it's a big red flashing whack me sign. Yeah. Okay.
Sure.
And so speaking of doing things kind of in the dark, when I'm writing stored procedures and I'm getting them out there and I want to test them, like how do I debug these things? What am I supposed to be doing?
Okay, I guess another sort of fairly unknown part of the Query Analyzer is that there is a stored procedure debugger built into Query Analyzer for SQL Server 2000. So if you want to step through your stored procedure within the Query Analyzer, there's a tree view pane. You can hit F8 if it's not there and it will pop up. And you can drill down your stored procedure and right-click it and go debug.
Sure.
And that'll allow you to put in some parameters. You can also roll it back so that you can run through your stored procedure, but if you don't want to change the data when it's finished, it'll roll back the data changes that were executed so you won't muck up your database. and you can actually step through sort of statement by statement through that stored procedure to actually debug it. Now, that's been there in 2000 since release, but surprisingly few developers actually make use of the stored procedure debugger.
Well, I think we're all sort of used to the idea of just randomly, strewing stored procedures all over the place and running them and just hoping that they're going to actually do something.
That's right.
So then to kind of mix this all together, what would be the process? Say, I've just written a stored procedure that's going to go in and grab some customer data and bring it back. How do I get that into this execution plan profiler thing that's going to show me where my bottlenecks are? What do? Do I drag it onto something, or do I just simply go up, like you said, to the menu and bang, bang, bang?
Yeah, if you can execute that in Query Analyzer, well, then you can see the execution plan. You just got to type in your statement, execute, and then the stored procedure name. Go to the menu, the query menus, show execution plan, and run it. And the execution plan will show. Now, you mentioned Profiler. So the Profiler is a slightly different tool which allows you to trace what's happening between a client and SQL Server.
Okay.
So the execution plan allows you to see the bits of a query or a batch and what's happening sort of internally to SQL Server. Profile allows you to track and get a list of the events which occur between a client and SQL Server, such as the statements that it's been asked to execute.
Sure.
Okay. So that is more suited to, say, if you've got a production server which is generally slow, or a development server which is slow, but you're not quite sure what's going on.
Yeah.
Well, then you can use Profiler to actually sort of monitor that system and see a list of all the things which are happening, so then you can perhaps isolate from that perspective, what's going on, and then drill down in Query Analyzer to things which are taking a long time. Because Profiler will show you things like the amount of CPU a statement's consumed, the amount of I/O, and the actual duration. So if you've got a server which is running a process and you actually just want to find out which bits are taking a long time, well, then you can use Profiler, find out the particular stored procedures or queries, and then take those and put them into Query Analyzer, and then use the execution plan to actually drill down into those and find out, well, which bit of these is really the problem, and optimize it that way.
Okay, so I have to interrupt you right here to say that anybody out there who happens to know what the secret namespace of the week was, that thing that I said to Chris about...
I know.
Chris, you don't count.
Oh.
Neither you nor your wife, nor your children... or whatever other, living things you have running around the house are allowed to enter this. But anybody else who happens to remember, now's the time to start dropping that namespace into the submission form so we can pick a winner. Okay, so while those are coming in, Tony, is there anything you wanted to basically... I'm sorry. Oh, yes, please, Carl.
We actually have a caller.
Carl, I called you Carl. Woo!
That's all right.
Chris, go ahead.
I'm just your Carl substitute today.
Right. You're like the pink Carl, like NutraSweet.
Right. Less filling, tastes great.
Yeah.
So we actually have a caller, and she is someone I'd love to get on the air because not only does she work with me, and in fact she's in charge of the MSDN Data Access and Storage Developer Center website.
Oh, sweet.
Okay. But she knows just like way more about this database stuff than I could ever know. So any questions or things that she would have for Tony would be fabulous. I would love it if we could get her on the phone.
Well,
and by the way, her name is Krista Carpentieri. I believe I've got that pronounced
Krista
correctly.
Carpentieri? Well, we'll just see about that. We'll go straight to the source. Krista, you there?
Yep, I'm here.
So how do we say your name?
Carpentieri, he got it right.
Oh, all right. Woo-hoo. Well, bravo, Chris. So, Chris, go ahead. You had something you wanted to ask her, some questions?
So, Krista, I mean, what can we do for you on this fine sunny day?
One thing I was hoping that Tony could bring up that I've seen as a common performance issue is you have developers who are coming from procedural languages and they want to use cursors. They don't get the set-based programming that underlies T-SQL at all. And I was going to see, is that something he's come across a lot? Because it's something I've seen pretty frequently.
Now, when you say frequently, I mean, Krista, how many people visit the data access and storage site? I mean, it's like tens of thousands of people, yes?
Yeah, I would say so. We have about 250,000 a month.
Yeah, okay. So
yes.
you get a lot of contact with a lot of people then.
Yeah, and also back in the day when I did consulting work, it wasn't something that I like to see, but it was something I came across a lot because your average developer, cursor's kind of like a record set, and that makes sense to them. So that's what they want to go for. So
Tony, what do you say to those people that want to use cursors?
So that's a common issue that we come across as the caller mentioned, that developers which are used to writing procedural row-by-row type processing commonly use cursors and stored procedures. And I actually have this rule which generally says in most situations you shouldn't use cursors in code which is being executed, I guess, as part of a production application. So the cursors are kind of okay for doing maintenance and batch work, but if it's an online process where users are sitting at the other end, well, then there should be a solution which doesn't require a cursor. Now, similar to that is the use of temporary tables, is that temporary tables allow the logic of what you're trying to do to be split up into sort of multiple steps, which is often easier for someone who's familiar with the procedural language to come to terms with, rather than creating this sort of complex SQL statement which does everything as one. So I think that cursors are kind of good for, I guess, newcomers to SQL for perhaps prototyping what they're trying to do and actually getting it out of their head into SQL Server. But I also think there should be a step post that, is once you've sort of worked out what you're trying to do, it's like a roll-up step or a grouping step to sort of take that logic and try and whittle it down into a reduced number of statements and into singular sort of SQL statements. Okay. Often there's more efficient ways of doing the same logic within a single statement, such as, because quite often to see a cursor opened on one table to insert rows into another table. So someone might open a cursor, rotate through a result set, and insert rows into another table based on the result of that cursor. Now, that is less efficient because it's processing row by row, whereas a single sort of insert statement based on a select list will do that as a single batch much more efficiently. So it's partly a learning curve, and it's also, I think, partly useful for prototyping, but there should be this sort of review step where you go through and actually try and collapse these statements down into as fewer SQL statements as possible.
So just the danger I see, and Christy, you jump in if I get this wrong, but I mean, if you actually do spend time and write cursor usage into your prototype applications, I could just see the classic, well, it works, let's just ship it, and then you're stuck with it.
Sure, well, that happens all the time, but I guess the main issue is I mentioned that I thought that may be a useful step for people that are new to SQL, because it's not always easy to change the mindset from writing these row-by-row processing to the statement which combines all this logic and goes off as a batch and does what you need in the single statement. So it's certainly not ideal, but apart from training and familiarizing yourself with SQL, there's not a lot that someone who's new to SQL can do to actually create sort of complex SQL statements without having some sort of more understanding.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I'd say as long as they're educated to know that they're going to suffer performance-wise if they stick with that over the long haul, it's not a bad interim step.
It's a way of getting the logic out of their head, I guess.
Right.
And it's hard, especially when you're trying to work out what the logic is, just to write a SQL statement that does it. Because you kind of think, well, first I've got to do this, then I've got to do this, and then I'll do this, and then I'll do this, and that's what I'm trying to do. And once it's out of your head and you can see it step by step by step, that's when you can start sort of saying, well, I can actually do this and this together, and then I can actually do this and this together, and actually collapse it up into a more complex but batch-based SQL statement.
I would argue that is the same issue that we have with any kind of distributed programming, that, what's the right granularity? How do you write your application logic in the kind of semi-connected, get some information, work on it, come back later, ask for another service. And then, of course, the hard part is prepare for if things have changed underneath in an unexpected way. And the nice thing about cursors, while they have that, overhead of locking things and holding the connection open, is, you don't have to worry about somebody coming along and changing things under you, which makes your programming simpler. Unfortunately, it also puts your scalability through the floor in terms of how many simultaneous users you can hold.
Sure, and it also affects end-to-end response time in most situations as well, right? So the actual user typically would be waiting longer than if you used a batch-based approach. So scalability.
That's true, but any individual user would be waiting longer, but overall the system would be able to hand far more, would scale better. And that's always the trade-off, right?
The system would scale better using the batch approach, yeah?
Yes, absolutely. Sure. Staying away from cursors is a good thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so I hope that answers everybody's questions because we're just about at the end here. So it's actually time to go on ahead and announce the winner of the secret namespace of the week thingy. And this week it is Eddie, and I don't know how to pronounce your last name, so I'm going to try 3 different pronunciations. I'm not sure if you're Spanish or Italian, and whether or not you're like from southeastern Spain or perhaps from Mexico. This is kind of tough. So Eddie Recio, RECIO, you have won Windows Server 2003 Standard Edition. So we've got your information here, and we're going to get in contact with you. And congratulations. Everybody clap. Let's get a little bit of clapping going on. Bravo. Bravo there, Eddie. Good job. And aside from that, Tony, did you have any last-minute thoughts or anything you wanted to go ahead and say to people before we take off?
Yes. Use your DBAs. Not scary anymore. And get ready for UConn.
All right. So that's some. Those are words to live by. So I guess then now is the time to thank you very much, Tony, for coming on the show.
Sure.
It was pretty cool. And thank you, Chris. Your check is in the mail. And thank you, users and listeners and readers and whoever else happens to be out there. This is .NET Rocks, and I'm Rory Blythe, just kind of shutting down the show and hoping I'm doing it right. So we'll see y'all next time.
Bye.
Bye.